What is the scariest story you know that is true? Story 1. In the 1930s, near my hometown, a man eliminated his wife, his Emil, and his 3 stepchildren, dismembered their bodies and hid them in the root cellar. My great-uncle and his father, my great-grandpa, were out hunting when their dog ran off barking. Uncle followed the dog and found a burlap bag. He opened it and found the head of one of the children. When he told us the story, he said he looked up and the man was standing right in front of him, another burlap bag in his hands. His dad arrived, scared the guy away, and they reported the head to the local cops, who found the rest of the victims and arrested the killer, who was executed, hanged, a couple months later. My uncle only told us the story once, but after he died, we found all the newspaper clippings about the takedown in a trunk under his bed. I think it must have haunted him his entire life, especially since one of the kids was his age. It's a bit of local history I grew up hearing about, but didn't realize my great-uncle was the one who found the bodies until I was a teenager, because he simply never talked about it except that one time. Story 2. Back in the 90s, a couple kids went missing. About 4 or 5 days later, my dad was fishing one night, thought he heard a gator, got his big Q-beam spotlight and pointed it toward the noise. It was a bloated dead body bobbing up and down in the water, eyes open and facing my dad. Turns out the kids had driven into the water by mistake, probably had been drinking. They found the other body a few hours later after my dad called it in. My dad was so traumatized that he never went night fishing again and honestly didn't fish much at all after that. Answer: oh shoot, it's the same with my granddad. Back in the 60s, Chinese girls, usually those that are no longer virgins, would commit tragic end after their boyfriends left them by tying a heavy rock to their ankles and threw it overboard into a local river so that they sunk with it and drowned. My granddad on my dad's side, that worked early in the morning as a fisherman, saw what he thought was a peculiar coconut in the water with long hair growing out of it. He used his paddle to scoop it up, only to come face to face with a severely rotten head. Turned out the body has decayed at the bottom of the river, and the rotten head separated from her neck and floated to the surface. Story 3. Sunshine Skyway Bridge Disaster in 1980. Imagine riding along a bridge when it's foggy out and then driving over a ledge to your passing in the waters below because a freighter crashed into and took out a giant portion of the bridge. Answer: yikes. Similar accident happened in Sweden in 1980 in the middle of the night and winter. A truck managed to stop just before the edge and was trying to flash his headlights for cars on the other side, but they kept going over. The boat that caused the accident also tried shooting emergency flares, causing one truck to stop briefly but continuing and going into the water. Story 4. There was this guy who kept noticing little things around his apartment felt off. But one night, he set up a hidden camera just to prove to himself he wasn't going crazy. When he checked the footage the next day, he saw this woman, an actual stranger, crawling out of a crawl space in his ceiling in the middle of the night. She'd been living up there for months, sneaking down when he was asleep or at work to eat and use his stuff. Answer: I just read a story on Reddit recently about a couple in Spain who were wondering why there was a wash basin full of soapy water in their kitchen sink, thinking one of them was sleepwalking. They asked Redditors, and one guy says someone must have been using it to wash themselves. They looked and looked, and they found a mattress in the attic, I think. But the trespasser was never found. Story 5. This happened 3 months ago, but a friend of mine bought a small house in a housing complex at the start of the year. She often heard her neighbor and his girlfriend arguing loudly, as did the other homes around them. One afternoon, she comes home from work to police and an ambulance in her cul-de-sac. She comes to find out that this neighbor had taken down his girlfriend. She tells the police she still heard him yelling 2 days prior. However, when the investigator came to officially interview her, he told her that the girlfriend had advanced decomposition to the extent that they couldn't get fingerprints from her. Keep in mind, this was in wintertime, which means he had been yelling at a corpse for a while. Scary part is the police still didn't arrest him, and he lived in the house until the girlfriend's brother evicted him since the home was in her name. Answer: my neighbor's son is somewhat unhinged. One time I called the police because he was yelling at his girlfriend. They came into my yard and listened for a while, and somehow were able to find out that his girlfriend was at her house, not his. But all three of us heard two voices. Turns out he was imitating her voice, her side of the argument, the whole time. Story 6. A lady in my city tortured her older kids, a 13-year-old and 9-year-old, to passing, and stuffed them into her deep freezer for 2 years. For those 2 years, her younger kids had to walk by that freezer, knowing their siblings were at the bottom of it. When she was caught, she said she had no regrets and that her children were demons. All over a delusion that the older kids were intimacy abusing the younger ones. Story 7. My cousin died unexpectedly in 2016 of what we assume was an extremely aggressive cancer. He left behind his wife and 2 boys, age 2 and a newborn. A couple years later, the wife entered a relationship with another guy who, by all accounts, was a stand-up character for both her and the boys. In 2021, the wife died of what everyone assumed was COVID. The boyfriend had her cremated extremely quickly and offered to take full custody of her sons. It soon came out that he had been abusing the boys, physically and intimacy. He skipped town. The boys were adopted by my cousin's relative, who brought them to see a child psychologist. When the therapist built enough rapport to ask the boys about the day their mother died, the boys proceeded to play act one person smothering another with a pillow. Meanwhile, the boyfriend was charged with the violation of a minor relative, but the trial was delayed on a technicality and then dropped when the victim recanted. Last I heard, late 2021. He's an assistant pastor at church in New Hampshire. Edit. Misspellings. Added info. Update. His full name is Marshall Corrado, possible middle name of Neil. It appears that he is now living in Southington, Connecticut. Previous address is Laconia, NH, where all this originally happened. There is no current association with a church that I can find. Someone with the same name was scheduled to appear at the Belknap County Superior Court in January of this year, but no updates on legal status since that time. Update 2. Here's a YouTube video featuring him and his ex-wife on some religious podcast. Had it confirmed by a relative willing to talk about it. Story 8. In my early 20s, my wife and I had a goal of climbing all of the 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado. We would typically hike up a decent portion of the peak the night before, set up a tent, and camp out and summit the next day. We were climbing Crestone Needle in August 2014 and set up camp before the tree line ended. We were in a remote wooded area near a creek that was raging pretty good at the time. No other campers around, no hikers seen going up or down, super quiet and peaceful. We cooked dinner over the fire and went to bed early. I woke up around 1 p.m. with the hair standing up on the back of my neck. The only thing I could hear was the creek roaring and the wind blowing. I remember feeling really uneasy, which was unusual because we camped out a lot and were very used to being out in the wilderness. I decided to get up and exit the tent. Immediately upon stepping out of the tent, I saw the outline of a man about 50 yards from our campsite. He was just standing still staring down at our camp. I yelled up at him, but didn't get a response. I poked my head into the tent to wake my wife up, and when I looked back for the man, he was gone. My wife and I talked about it and agreed that it was probably an early hiker who was starting their summit push early. Both of us felt uneasy, and neither of us were able to go back to sleep. I laid in the tent for about another 45 minutes, meaning wide awake. I decided to get back out of the tent to have a look around. I stepped out of the tent and walked around, still feeling a little uneasy. Didn't see anything and still couldn't hear shoot. Started going back towards my tent, and when I turned to my left, I saw the guy again. This time he was very close. maybe 25 or so from our tent behind some brush. I yelled at him again and started running his direction. He took off and I lost sight of him. I got my wife out of the tent, we got all of our stuff packed up, and we left. The 2HR walk back to the car in the pitch black was honestly the most terrifying part of it all. Answer: Crestone. Not surprising. That place is beautiful, but absolute cult and crazy person central. That's where the cult of Mother God had their idiocy. There is a really good podcast called Up and Vanished about a disappearance, likely takedown there, and tons of historic news articles about incidents in the region. I go hiking there periodically, but will not go unarmed. Story 9. The Case of Clive Waring. He's a musician who contracted a virus that destroyed the part of his brain that forms new memories. He has anterograde amnesia, meaning his memory only lasts for about 30 seconds. He is constantly waking up for the first time, every single moment of his life. He keeps a diary, and it's filled with entries minutes apart, each one saying something like 10:45 a.m., I am now awake, with all the previous entries crossed out because he has no memory of writing them. It's the true story of a man trapped in a never-ending moment, and the thought of that is scarier to me than any ghost story. Answer: My sociology professor showed us a documentary or TV program about Clive. This would have been around 1992. It haunts me to this day, in part because Clive himself was, at least at all moments in this one program, profoundly joyful because he couldn't contextualize it. He did have it written down in his notebook and would often check back and had a little bit of understanding what had happened to him, but then his wife would walk in the room and he would light up with delight to see her again, and if a stranger walked in, he greeted them nearly as warmly. For him, at least at that point, he lived basically a stress-free life. Story 10. The Nutty Putty Cave tragedy still gives me chills. A guy named John Jones got stuck exploring a narrow section of the cave in Utah in 2009. He was trapped head first, wedged so tightly that even rescue teams couldn't free him. He stayed like that for over 24 hours before he died, still talking to rescuers and praying in his final hours. They eventually sealed the cave permanently with his body inside. Knowing he was alive, conscious, and waiting for passing in total darkness is one of the scariest real stories I've ever read. Story 11. There was this super eerie case in Lebanon involving a family of weirdos from a village called Kfar Shima. Neighbors had been whispering about them for years due to their reclusiveness and antisocial behavior. But it wasn't until last summer that the authorities broke into their property and found 5 dead bodies in different states of decay in a hidden locked room under the house. Turns out, the eldest son had been quietly stashing his own deceased siblings and father down there since the 1980s, claiming it was a family ritual and that he was just fulfilling their wish to be buried at home. While some died of natural causes, one brother, George Al-Fatah, had been eliminated by another sibling, Khalil, during the Lebanese Civil War. Khalil took his own life in 2000, and a baby girl named Marie died at 1 year old for reasons that remain unknown. But it's rumored that one of the brothers had eliminated her out of jealousy. The eldest brother, Christo Al-Fatah, was living there with his senile 90-year-old mother. He was arrested. The mother was sent to an elderly care facility, and the bodies were finally given a proper burial. Such a creepy family, and the story was absolute nightmare fuel when it broke out. Story 12. You can wake up blind. Happened to me in 22. In short, I have a super rare disease called Azor. Best they can guess, my body's immune system attacked my eye's immune system. Yes, they're separate, and ate chunks of my retinas. It's still doing so, but not quite as vigorously as it did before I started seeing the results, which manifested as a sudden inability to see through my contacts or glasses. Anyways, I can still see a little bit out of half of one eye at a strength of 11.0. But I woke up like that after 38 years of seeing 2010 with contacts or glasses. Was definitely hard to adjust to. Oh, and since autoimmune loves to travel in packs, I now also have RA and psoriatic arthritis, and my diabetes is getting worse. Yay! I'm the queen of autoimmune. Answer: my family has a history of Hashimoto's. My dad, me. And we didn't know that autoimmune stuff happens as a sort of BOGO deal. Until my dad's immune system suddenly started attacking his lungs. One day, he went from having what we thought was COVID, and a day later, he was in a medically induced coma and hooked up to ECMO. Thankfully, once we pointed out he already had an autoimmune disorder, they figured out it was a type of vasculitis, and he's stable now, but has to get infusions a few times a year. I'm very much not excited to find out what my BOGO deal gets me. Story 13. I'm assuming you mean ones we are kinda connected to in some way. So I'll go with one of those. I worked for a year or two at a chemical-type company a long time ago, 90s I think, and they had a big announcement. The company wasn't doing quite as well as they'd hoped financially. One of the guys in the crowd was muttering how they'd better not be talking about layoffs. And of course, that's exactly what they did. So the guy who was muttering apparently went straight out to the parking lot where his truck was and got his rifle out, and was immediately swarmed by police, because they had always seen him as a bit of a concern, so they prepared for exactly that. Big thank you to whomever thought ahead that far, rather than just assuming it would be okay. This was before mass shootings were quite as popular as today. Story 14. My great-aunt woke up to her dog growling in the middle of the night. When she checked a window, a man in a ski mask was standing there and said, "Party time." She screamed she had a gun, and her dog went crazy barking until he ran off. She bought a gun after that. I can't even think about what would have happened to her if she didn't have her dog to warn her. Story 15. This happened to me. While in college, I was working alone at a retail store in a shopping mall. I had closed shop for the day, and I was the only person in the store. I took some stuff to the stock back room, which also had a small card table with 4 chairs around it for meal breaks. I returned to the front of the store to continue closing up. I was out there for like 10 minutes, then went to the back room to get my coat. When I stepped into the back room, all 4 of the chairs were facing the door in a perfectly straight line, several feet from where they should be at the table. These fudge chairs had moved and changed direction silently with no one else but me there. I noped the fudge out, called mall security. They searched the store and found it empty. They said I probably moved the chairs and forgot. I never worked there alone again. Story 16. About 13 years ago, my sister came home from college for the summer. One day, she got a frantic phone call from one of her roommates. Turns out, these girls were not worried in the slightest about locking the doors to the house. This roommate was taking a shower, got out of the shower, and was drying off when she heard a noise coming from the vent directly above her. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight and pointed it up at the vent, and all she managed to see was an eyeball staring at her before she justifiably flipped out and sprinted out of the house in nothing but a towel. She called 911, and the police went into the attic and arrested a homeless man who had literally just been walking around checking for unlocked doors, allegedly. Then it all started to make sense why food was going missing, and the girls assumed someone was lying about taking food. I have zero clue how it was possible that this creature was looking through a vent. But it happened. Answer: listen to a story similar to this on YouTube recently. Difference was, in this one, it's an apartment with 5 rooms, one of which was unoccupied after the girl living there passed away. Well, after noticing weird shoot happening, one girl started trying to figure out what was going on. The other girls kind of brushed it off. Well, eventually, one girl was home alone and heard a noise. She left her room and ran into the homeless dude living in the dead girl's room, and he subsequently beat the absolute shoot out of her. Fudge terrifying. Story 17. Co-worker was almost a victim of takedown tragic end. Her husband was holding a gun to her head, telling her he was eliminate her for her sake as the world is so terrible. Standoff with police lasted long enough for her to get a chance to shove him away. He shot himself in the head before she even got far enough away to avoid the splatter. She had to quit her job after due to the PTSD and the fact that she was a nurse in a mental health ward. She also needed a police guard around her house for the next month due to writers, read news jockeys, kept trying to break in to get the story. After that, she changed her name in order to avoid talking about it. The only reason she told me is because she had to take a call at the call center we work in, not even remotely related to healthcare, where the woman on the other line was tragic end and couldn't get through to the tragic end hotline. I was just trying to calm her down enough to drive home. Story 18. My mother went to a recruitment meeting with Heaven's Gate founders due in Thai. She wanted to join, but they wouldn't take children. Years later, when they transitioned, she dug out the pamphlet they were giving out and told me the story. Story 19. My mother wanted to sell the old family station wagon back in the mid-1970s. She had a phone call from an interested buyer, but something about him seemed off. She told my dad that she wanted him there when the guy came to look at it, and my dad was the one who went with him when he took it out for a test drive. They ended up selling it to him. Turns out later, the guy take down someone and used the station wagon to take the body somewhere. I don't recall if he was a serial killer, but that was a very uncomfortable brush with danger. My mom's intuition might have saved her life. Story 20. I live not far from Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. We had a serial killer who would pick up prostitutes and bring them back to his farm to party. Then he would eliminate them and feed them to his pigs. He would also sell the pork to friends' neighbors. Answer: he eliminate one of my aunties. We didn't know what happened to her till they busted his farm. We don't know for sure that she was eliminated by Robert Picton, but her quantum card, treaty card, an ID, and possibly a purse were found on his property. So that's the most closure we will ever get, I expect. I mean, how would it have gotten there otherwise? Auntie lived rough, had her issues, residential school trauma. Intimacy work was how she got by, and that fudge went and eliminate her, along with so many others. Story 21. Lived in Arbroaths at the time and worked in Brecon. They take down her and dismembered her in a house round, from where I used to do my shopping. The police dive teams were diving in Arbroath Harbor for a few days, looking for the rest of her after her head washed up on the beach. How awful that something like this would happen in two small Scottish communities. Story 22. This might make me seem like a weirdo, but fudge it. So in my mid-20s, I started at a new company with a lovely boss lady. She was awesome, and soon feelings developed between the two of us. We started dating, obviously on the down low. She was early 40s, so a pretty good age gap. We dated for about 3 years, and I won't bore you with the details, but things did not work out. I did love her a lot though, and often think she might have been the one, if not for the age difference. I don't know. It might be a rose-colored glasses kind of thing. Anyways, a couple years later, working at a different place. A small family business, not mine, that I funnily enough got with a stunning reference from my ex-lady friend. The business knew my ex because one of their relatives had dated her in high school. Small fudge world. One Saturday night, sitting on my couch feeling sad and lonely, and get the great idea to go through my old phone that is kept in a bag in my closet with all the other old tech. I know we all have these that are filled with iPods, iPhones, Blackberries, and 1,000 cables we're too afraid to throw out. So I plug this phone in to charge and start going through the messages. I stumble across the text chain between me and my ex. I start to reminisce, and sure enough, I find a pic of her in her bra and think, well, that will do for the night. I know, pathetic. Monday morning arrives and I head into work. The office lady comes up to me and was like, "Hey, did you hear about Jessica?" The fake name giving my ex. And I was like, how the fudge did she know I was creeping? So I responded dumbly with Jessica from my old job who I used to date, as if she didn't know who we were talking about. Haha. And she was like, yeah, Jessica passed away in her sleep on the weekend. The police found her on a wellness call after she didn't show up for work. I was stunned. I must have been looking at our old text convo either hours before she was going to die or possibly as she lay dead in her bed. I couldn't help myself and told this to the office lady. She told me shivers just ran up her spine. I have no idea why I chose that night after 2 years to go through my old phone and fixate on my ex. It was just something kinda calling me. Answer: similar. I had a good friend that lived many states away, and as we both had school-age kids, we didn't speak often and the time between check-ins started to grow. I dreamt of him and sent a quick check-in email, but never heard back. Then I saw his obituary that his wife had posted. He'd eliminate himself the night I had dreamt of him. I wonder if I had reached out sooner if it would have made a difference. Story 23. Hinterkaifeck. In 1922, a Bavarian family was taken down on their farm after footprints were found leading in from the woods with none leading out. The killer stayed for days feeding the animals and using the stove, then vanished. Story 24. Back in 2006, when my older sister was moving to a new city for work, my parents and I helped apartment hunt for her. My sister found a really nice apartment in a nice locality which was absolutely perfect on paper. The residents were all working women. The landlady seemed super nice to my sister, and the location and rent were ideal. The only thing left to do was for my parents to meet the landlady and finalize the documents. However, after my mom met the landlady for the first time, she told us that she had a weird feeling about her and asked us to keep apartment hunting. So that's what we did. Anyway, fast forward a year or so, and we find out from the local newspaper that the landlady was into black magic, and she had allegedly taken down some of the residents to use as sacrifices for her rituals. I wish I was lying. Till date, it is one of the most terrifying things I've read. Edit. So this incident happened in Bangalore in the year 2006-2007. I'm assuming the news coverage would have taken place in 2008-2009. I'm 100% sure this happened, but I'm unable to find a news article that talks about it, partially because there was another takedown in a PG in 2024, and I can only find articles pertaining to that incident. I will keep looking for this, but if anyone else comes across this article, I'd like to see it as well. Apologies for not coming up with a source at the moment. Story 25. Many years ago, on a road trip from LA to San Francisco, husband and I stopped at a rest stop. We slept there for a couple of hours, and then when the sun rose, I went to use the restroom. Stepping inside, I noticed papers were taped to the mirror. I had to use the toilet really bad, so I just stepped into the stall. Washing my hands after, I looked up and read the paper on the mirror before me. It said, "If you want a good time, call XXX." Then it describes what he was capable of doing and how and his extraordinary God-given attributes that would be used in the process. Then, at the bottom of the paper, it said, "But if you don't want to call, I will be right outside the door by the big tree waiting for you." My heart just went cold and I froze. I don't want to move, and I am looking around to see if he is in the restroom, feeling stupid for not reading that paper before or checking the stalls. I just stood there and waited for what seemed an eternity for my husband to notice that I was gone too long and come get me. It wasn't that long, but it felt that way. I ran out, grabbed my husband, and went to the car. I looked back, and sure enough, there was a guy by the tree, just outside the door, exactly the way he described himself, the exterior part anyway. And he looked at me, then quickly looked away. This was way before cell phones, so there was no way for me to call police. Never again have I gone into a public bathroom and not checked. Story 26. My grandparents lived in the desert on 4 acres. A year or two after they died, natural causes within several months of each other, their neighbor's property was raided. They found a secret underground bunker where he'd, I believe, molest boys. This guy was a lawyer and helped my parents with the estate. I've searched for news about it, but this was like 1990. I was a teenager, and my parents told me about it. Story 27. In the 2000s, I worked for a residents' organization on a council estate in South London, housing project for U.S. readers. It was poor as you would expect, with high crime but a good community. The estate consisted of 5 high-rise tower blocks, with our office in the basement of one. The other basements were used for storage, and it was part of my job to check them regularly. They were big basements. The blocks were oblongs on their sides rather than slim point blocks. The basements were dark with minimal lighting, dark corners, echoing and creepy. You get the picture. One of the residents of the estate told me they used to use the basements for their own storage, but back in the 80s, a 6-year-old child had gone missing on the estate, and after a frantic search, her body was found in the basement of one of the blocks. She'd been intimacy assaulted and taken down. A homeless man was arrested and convicted. I can't remember if he'd been living down there or not. The man who told me was an elderly, long-time resident who was well respected. He said he could still remember the screams of her mother. I worked there for years, and it would be mentioned every now and again by various older residents, who always talked about the mother's screams. Obviously, this made checking that particular basement a bit creepy to say the least. Some staff wouldn't go down there at all. I had to leave hurriedly a few times after getting the fear, but never saw anything supernatural. I searched the internet at various points looking for evidence of the story, but could never find anything. Then a few years ago, suddenly there it was. Probably the result of a newspaper putting their archives online. It was exactly how I'd been told, and pretty horrifying. Story 28. The movie Society of the Snow, or La Sociedad de la Nieve. That plane crash really happened, and the survivors had to eat human meat and anything, really, even cigarettes to survive. Story 29. In 1991, my brother's best friend, B, witnessed the takedown of his family. B lived on an acreage with his grandparents, his cousin, and his uncle. It was during summer break, and the uncle shot the grandparents and cousin, put the bodies on a brush pile to burn them, and then took B into town for ice cream. B was only 7 years old. We never saw him again, and it really tore my brother up. We lived in a very rural, boring area, so it was a huge shock. Nothing like that had ever happened before. Until 2022, when a woman I'd gone to school with was taken down by her husband in an attempt to get her life insurance and also free himself up for the other secret relationship he had going. He tried to stage it as an accident, that she had been crushed by a round hay bale that fell off the tractor forks. But the investigators noted she had blunt force trauma to the head inconsistent with his story. Even more fudge up is that they had a house fire a year prior that he claimed started when he was deep frying pierogies at 3 a.m., but most people now suspect was his first attempt at takedown her. Story 30. I had a dude pretend to be like a priest or something when he asked me for a ride and pretended to need money for his kid's surgery. I later found out he stabbed somebody. He never gave me the gas money he promised either. Go figure, I guess it's not the scariest store, but it was pretty crazy to me at the time. Story 31. The scariest story I know would be the Villisca axe takedown. Happened in Villisca, Iowa in 1912. A husband, wife, their 4 children, and 2 neighbor children came home from a church service, had cookies and milk, and went to bed. That night, they were all taken down in their beds with an axe. The next morning, their neighbor noted that it was pretty late and nobody had done the chores. All the doors were locked, so she got a hold of the husband's brother to check on the family. That when they were discovered. What made it so heinous were a lot of people trampled through the house, destroying any evidence. They never found out who did it. Story 32. In 2008, I was working at an ad agency downtown, Madison, WI. There were two takedown downtown that summer, Brittany Zimmerman and Kelly Nolan. They were both brutal, and it shook everyone up badly. I worked long hours, and a couple of times I was the last one out of the building. It made the walk to my car really scary those nights. Story 33. A British family's neighbor kept insisting that the kids were yelling insults and heckling him when they were outside playing in the garden. Only the father immediately knows it's bullshit because the kids are too afraid of the neighbor to even go outside. When the father confronts the neighbor for his lies, the neighbor threatens him and expressly threatens the lives of the kids, the oldest no older than 6, making it clear that he'll teach those kids some manners. Naturally, the father calls the police. Here's where it gets worse. The neighbor's name was Harry Street, and when the police started investigating the threats, a junior officer noted that despite being close to his 70s, the incident took place in 2013, none of Harry's public records start until the mid-90s. Junior officer immediately realizes that Street is living not only under an assumed name, but an assumed name given to him by the government. This means he's an ex-con whose crimes were so notable that the police had to give him a fake name after his release for his own safety. But there are no clues to his former identity on his police records. Around the mid-90s is when they switch from paper records to computer databases, and sadly, it's not uncommon for some paper records to have not been transferred over to the databases due to human record. Luckily, they still kept the original paper records just in case such a situation ever arose. She goes to the paper storage facility, tracks down Street's real criminal record, and calls the family in the middle of the night to warn them to get the fudge out of their house immediately, while also getting armed response to kick his door in, where they find an arsenal of handmade guns, ammo, and bombs. Harry Street was once known as Barry Williams, and as a result of psychotic and paranoid delusions caused by being an undiagnosed schizophrenic, Williams went on a spree provoked by his delusions in the 1970s. He was institutionalized for 20 years until he was determined to recognize the error of his ways and the need to self-manage his condition, but immigrated to Spain right after his release without letting the police know about.